Hi everyone and welcome to today's webinar. Many apologies for the slight delay to the start. We were just checking a couple of things, but we're ready to go now. I'll shortly be handing over to Sian Clarke and Deri Bevan just to talk you through supporting colleagues with redundancy during this coronavirus pandemic. Just to talk you through the platform that we're on, you'll see at the side of the screen there's a chat panel, and it's great to see so many of you already introducing yourselves, so please tell us a bit about yourselves there. And underneath the video there's an ask a question panel. Please post any questions there for Sian and Deri and we'll get to them afterwards. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Sian and she'll introduce herself and get going with the webinar.
Hi everybody, hope everybody's okay in these very strange times. You might already know me, you might have seen me at various WTUC events before. My name is Sian Clarke. I'm one of the employment solicitors at the offices Slater and Gordon in Cardiff. That's where I'm based. And I'm just going to be giving you some general information today in relation to the coronavirus job retention scheme, furloughing and various pointers in relation to that. And obviously I'm free to answer any queries you've got in respect of redundancy or any other sort of employment issues that are going on at the moment. So obviously you'll be aware that the government has introduced certain measures to try and protect employees' rights during these precarious times, and the new sort of provision of furloughing has come into play. Now, for a furlough situation to take place, an employer and employee has to agree, and it means that the employee can be kept on the payroll if there's no work for them, or if the sort of employer has nothing for them to do for this period of time. And when a person is furloughed, they're able to receive up to 80% of their wages, up to a cap of 2,500. So it works whereby an employer will sort of start the ball rolling. An employee themselves can't make an application for the scheme. The employee must have been on the employer's books from before the 28th of February. So I know that, for example, I've got a colleague who's leaving Slater and Gordon due to be joining a new employer at the beginning of May, and she's not going to be eligible for this. So, you know, there's going to be quite a lot of people who are going to sort of slip through the net, as it were, but hopefully it is going to be able to cover a lot of people. And so what happens is the employer will normally make an approach to the employee. I know from personal experience, because my husband is now on furlough, and so I've had sight of the letter that he's been sent by his employer in terms of how it's all set up. And when you are on furlough, obviously you're not able to go and work for anybody else, although you can take up voluntary work. It is a change to your terms and conditions of employment. And so, as I say, there has to be an agreement to it. If there's not an agreement by the employer, then obviously there's the risk that by the employee, there's a risk that the employer might then proceed to redundancy. And I know that having spoken to Deri, who's given me some sort of very useful sort of pointers on the issues that are arising at the moment, then sort of redundancy in the current circumstances is one of those issues. Now, a redundancy situation should be exactly the same in these sort of times as it would be ordinarily. There would still be the ordinary processes that have to be followed. There has to be a right to consultation, a right to redundancy pay, a right to notice pay. And if somebody's been on a furlough situation, obviously we won't know because it's very, very new. But I know that there might be some question about if you are ultimately made redundant, what would your sort of redundancy pay be calculated on? And I would always sort of suggest that the redundancy payment would have to be calculated on your ordinary wages, whatever your wages were prior to the furlough scheme, because obviously we know with the furlough scheme, you're only receiving up to 80%. And so if you're then having a redundancy payment calculated in some 3 months' time, it obviously has to sort of revert back to your ordinary pay, what you would have been paid at 100%. So it applies to agency workers and also temporary workers and foreign nationals. You might have a situation where somebody has been on maternity leave and receiving only statutory maternity pay. And in those circumstances, that employee might feel it's more advantageous to try and secure a furlough situation, because then they can revert back to 80% of their wages if it's going to be higher than their statutory maternity pay. And so that might be something that you're being asked to do on behalf of any members that you may have who are currently on maternity leave. There's also sort of a question around whether or not any employees who are on sick leave at the moment can ask to return to work to be furloughed, but that's not going to apply, because if you are on sick leave and you have medical confirmation from your GP, hospital, etc., to say that you are not fit for work, then the employer is under no obligation to take you back to put you onto the furlough scheme, even though it might mean that you would be sort of receiving more money on the furlough scheme than you are on sick pay, for example, if you've been off and you're now on sort of half pay or whatever. Obviously, the equality legislation still applies in these times. And so the employer, when they are looking to operate this furlough scheme, they have to ensure that they are adhering to equality legislation and making sure that those in vulnerable groups are not being adversely affected in any way. So those are sort of some general pointers in relation to the scheme as it stands at the moment. But obviously, as I'm on the webinar and I'm available for sort of any further specific queries. But I think I'll hand you over to Deri now. Hopefully I haven't gone on too long, Deri.
Am I up? Thanks, Sian. Am I on, Anna?
You are.
Thank you. Right. Hello, everybody. Thanks to Sian for agreeing to help us out with this webinar today. It's clear from what Sian was saying and from conversations I've been having with officials and reps in recent weeks that it's a really difficult time to be getting accurate information out to workers and supporting workers as best we can. So especially when a lot of that information moves so quickly and we're not physically in the workplace to talk to people. So we do know that redundancy is still happening in Wales currently. I've been liaising with the React team with the unions this week on one or two of those myself. And projections are difficult at the moment, but we do know that we are likely to have more redundancies coming at us down the line. So this is why we're doing this thing today. I'm going to try and cover the support that's available, but it's important to note at this point there's two types of support. There's the one type of support which is available for people who are currently going through redundancy and to notice the redundancy. But there's also quite a bit of support for people who are at risk of redundancy. So at this point, it's important to note the sooner we know at the Wales TUC from reps and officials about potential redundancies, the quicker we can get support to them. So there's loads to get through, but we've got the presentation up on the screen. We've got a web page that's gone up on our website that's got all the links and all the information. So don't panic if I don't cover it all. But also, Wales TUC staff whose job it was to support officials through redundancy advice before this sort of kicked off are still available, so feel free to get in touch. So the support programs in Wales, really important to say all the support that was available before this crisis is still available. It's just how some of the eligible activity has changed, and obviously what training is available is different. There's still a multi-agency approach in Wales through React. Funding is really important, but I just want to say at this point that don't underestimate advice and guidance and signposting. I've seen so many redundancy situations where people have been turned around into a more positive attitude and raised their confidence through just knowing what's out there, the resources that are available on the Careers Wales website, Work in Wales website, things like TV matches and stuff like that. So whilst the funding is important, important not to underestimate the advice and guidance element. So I'll start with React. So to take you through the basics, and then I'll highlight any of the important changes that have happened as a result of the crisis. So React helps people affected by redundancy gain new skills and support them into new employment. It's been going for nigh on 20 years now, and unions have always been a close partner of it. It's been very successful. To be eligible for React, you have to be living in Wales, become unemployed in the last 3 months, and have not been in continuous employment for 6 weeks in that time. Here's the first important caveat change. They've effectively waived that 3-month rule. So they'll consider all applications arising from redundancies from the 1st of January this year. So that's an important change. So the 3-month rule has been waived. So effectively, you're entitled to React if you're under notice of redundancy or have been through redundancy since the 1st of January. There are 3 elements to React. There's the recruitment and training support, which is a wage subsidy available to employers taking on redundant workers, up to £3,000 in a year. They get a £1,000 additional training grant with that. There may be some issues with furlough around that, and Welsh Government are looking at that at the moment, but we don't know any more details about that. There's the vocational training grant, which is available to individuals, up to 100% of training costs, up to £1,500 per person. And then there's a discretionary award as well, which I'm not sure will get used at the moment, which is largely about sort of childcare costs, travel costs for training and that sort of stuff. The grant itself is focused on getting people back into work as quickly as possible. So the training you can do is largely vocationally based, short-term stuff. But I just want to say at this point, you know, people do use it to change careers. People do change it to become self-employed. So Welsh Government will look at it on a case-by-case basis. So when you talk to Careers Wales, it's important to have, you know, some ideas and can possibly think outside the box. The process itself is important to say that Careers Wales are key. So it all goes through Careers Wales. They usually do sort of workplace presentations to groups of workers affected by redundancy, but this is the second big change. Obviously, that's not possible at the moment. So this multi-agency presentation they do along with Job Centre Plus and the union is now available online. This explains the process. It covers things like how it affects people's benefits. It's really important part of the process, and it is available online, and that link is on our website. The next stage then would be Careers Wales one-to-ones. This is probably the most important bit because you need this process to get signed off for the application. This is where you get the tailored advice specific to the individual, and they're now doing them online and over the telephone as well. So those links are available on our webpage. So those are their 2 big pages in terms of how they do that. The process then would be Careers Wales sign off the application. Then they send it to Welsh Government who consider it case by case. And then they'll notify the individual within 10 days. So another big change is digital applications. Welsh Government never used to allow digital applications. It was all paper-based, wet signatures, all that sort of thing. So now they're taking digital applications, they're receiving and approving digital applications. Careers Wales will talk you through that, but also TUC staff show you how to do that. You know, they're digital application forms, and you can send types of ID in different ways. It's secure email addresses with Welsh Government. So that's an important change as well. Key thing is the options for training has obviously changed at the moment. So the typical stuff that a lot of people do with React can't be delivered, like the face-to-face stuff, things like plant licenses, forklift truck driving, etc. But it's really important that that shouldn't put people off applying, because they got a deferred application process now, which is another new change. So there's 2 ways you can defer. You can apply and then defer the training till lockdown's finished, or you can defer your application entirely and, you know, apply when the lockdown's over and you can do this sort of training. But what's available online and digitally is changing quite a lot. And this is another time where it'd be worth talking to Careers Wales and Wales TUC staff about what's available. There are things like, off the top of my head, driver's CPC, Print 2, manual handling, ILM, IOS, lots of things that can be done digitally. Welsh Government wouldn't traditionally allow online learning as part of React, but now they are sort of relaxing that a little bit. But a very important point is they will be looking for this course to have some sort of live online tutor interaction, you know, sort of teaching or assessment online, not just to follow a workbook process. There is a Q&A coming out from Welsh Government on the changes to how you can access React. It's not quite ready yet, but it will go up on our web pages as soon as it's ready. Finally, the support, and this is the support that sort of focuses on people who are maybe not quite at the point of redundancy yet, and that's the support through the PUC and through Wolf. Wolf's always worked really well alongside React, and things can fall outside of React eligibility, things like if you're not yet under notice, certain types of eligible training, you know, maybe not allowed in React, but they could be with Wolf. And we are currently putting together a whole list of all the 18 Wolf projects and how they're repurposing themselves to deliver more online training and more complementary training for React as well. And that'll be available sort of probably very soon next week. Easter got in the way a little bit, so hopefully that will be ready early next week. So that's about it, really. There's loads of information, so have a look on our webpage. Like I said, the support is still available, and just another call to sort of officials and reps to let us know as soon as they possibly can about potential redundancy situations, because the sooner we know about them, the quicker we can get the right support. I don't know how long I took there, Anna.
No, all good, Deri. Okay, so thanks both. We're going to just have a look at some of the questions that have come in during the presentation. I'm going to put you both up. Right, let me see. We've had a question. So I think this one's for Sian, saying, I've received information that a company has sent out a letter to employees that their union has collectively agreed a furlough. Is this correct?
So a member has received a letter to say that their union has collectively agreed a furlough.
That's right. Yeah. Is this a correct procedure? Is this a correct thing?
Yeah, I mean, I would imagine that there is usually some discussion between, say, for example, a line manager and members of their team before this is going to happen. But I know, as I say, from sort of personal experience here at my house, even with my husband receiving his letter from Chorus, he's received a letter exactly along those lines, saying that after consultation and talks with the trade unions, it's been a furlough, but the employee has to agree to the furlough. So if in this particular case, this member hasn't had any previous consultation, any discussion, or hasn't agreed, then really the furlough can't take place. I would say the only sort of caveat with that is that if employees are saying they're not willing to agree, then obviously the other alternative is that the employer says, well, we've got no work for you, we make you redundant. So it's a bit of a strange one, but I would say that there probably should have been some consultation first with individual employees, but it's not unusual to receive a letter along those lines. But if that member has got any queries, any issues, then obviously if they raise it sort of first of all with their first contact, their rep, and then potentially sort of move forward if they do think that they've got any potential employment issue.
Great, thanks, Sian. So we've also had a question that says, this is from Gareth, saying, can you be furloughed to look after your children as the school is shut?
Sorry, can you repeat that again, Anna? Sorry, can you be
furloughed to look after your children as their school is shut?
Yeah, if you have a situation where you are unable to work and you are homeschooling, then that might be a reason that you might ask your employer to agree to a furlough. There's some sort of it's good actually that this has come from Gareth and not a female member, because I know that there's some discussion now that the policy that has come into place hasn't really been thought through in terms of the discriminatory effects it may have, because the majority of people who are going to be caring for children are predominantly female, and that if you have a huge swathe of female workers who are now going to be asking for furlough because of the homeschooling situation, there's a worry that that may impact on them when all this finishes, and in a future sort of redundancy situation, they may be the first on the cards in a redundancy sort of consultation because they requested furlough at this time. So I know that there's sort of real worries for everybody, but I know that you know, asking for a furlough because you do need to be homeschooling your young children are home from school, you've got no other sort of means of care, then that is a reasonable request to make.
Thanks, Sian. Next question was sent in advance of the webinar. We've had a few questions that were sent in prior to us going live. This one is perhaps for Deri, saying, I've claimed React before. Can I claim it again if I'm made redundant in my new job?
Yeah, you can, absolutely. There is quite a few people over the years who've applied to React numerous times. So yeah, if you take up a new job and then you're made redundant from that, you are eligible for React.
Excellent, thanks. Another one for Sian, I think. If an employee agrees to reduce working week in the interim, could they later be furloughed?
Yes, you know, that there's no sort of nothing preventing an employer at a later stage. Obviously, you might have a situation in the first instance where when all of this sort of first started, some employers, what they were doing is having people in sort of a team A and a team B. You might only go to work for 2 days a week, and then you would go to work for another sort of 2 days a week once the opposite team had done their 2 days, in order to try and keep social distancing and obviously, you know, work drying up, as it were. But now, once the government have introduced this scheme, even though you may have been on a reduced sort of working schedule, now that this scheme is introduced, your employer may decide that this would be, you know, more beneficial, and so there's nothing to prevent an employer moving to this sort of furlough position, although they've previously tried to take steps to sort of address the issues of you know, no work prior to this scheme coming in.
Great, thanks. Another question that was sent in advance about React. So the person asks, I live in England but work in Wales. Am I still able to claim React?
Unfortunately not. It's a bit parochial, isn't it? But yeah, no, it's effectively, there used to be a rule whether you lived or worked in Wales, but I think it's European funding rules now that sort of dictate that you have to have a Welsh address at the point of application.
Okay, thanks. So another question now about redundancy. The person asks, can I be made redundant because I'm pregnant?
No, you can't. That would be an act of discrimination. You may have a claim for pregnancy-related discrimination in the Employment Tribunal. Obviously, it's difficult to give you sort of a more detailed answer, because it could be that your employer is making everybody redundant, and therefore your pregnancy is, you know, it is not a factor, because there are genuine reasons. You know, the premises may be closing down, the company might be moving or shutting one sort of leg of their business. But if you believe that you have been selected for redundancy and pregnancy is one of the reasons that you've been selected, then that would be unlawful.
Okay, thanks, Sian. So the next question is there any action you can take if the employer refuses to furlough you in favour of reduced work/pay to continue services?
No. Well, because the furlough situation, there has to be agreement between employer and employee, then I think that you may find it difficult if there is still work that your employer can give you, albeit potentially reduced. Obviously, I would say that it would be something for if there is union presence on site, then speak to your union representative to see whether or not there can be any discussions. But if services are still being offered, if the company still has work that it's doing and believes that they can keep their employees on, then I think that you may be in a difficult situation, as I say, because there has to be agreement between employer and employee refurloughing. But I would speak to your trade union representative.
Thanks, Sian. Okay, we've had a question just posted now from Joy, and Joy asks, can I access React if I'm on a 0 hours contract?
Right. This is theoretically, yes. But there has been some issues in the past with agency workers, depending on, but if they've been in employment and they're eligible, therefore, for redundancy from that employment contract, in order to access React, you have to have a letter that says, with a date that says you are under notice of redundancy. So obviously, agency workers may not qualify for redundancy, so may not get that letter, or if they're employed by the agency itself, then I don't think they are eligible for React. But if they've been employed for the right amount of time and they get a letter saying your contract will end on such a date, then they are eligible for it.
Okay, thanks, Deri. Another question from Gareth, and he asks, if an employer furloughs staff and then asks them to do some work from home, what's their recourse? Can they refuse?
Sorry, can you say that? Was that to me, Deri? Or
yeah, I think so. Sorry. If an employer furloughs staff and then asks them to do some work from home, what's their recourse? Can they refuse?
Yes, they should refuse. If you are on furlough, then you are not required to, say, for example, there was going to be a big team meeting or something like that. You are not required to attend any meetings, to do any work for your employer. Obviously, your employer may say that they are bringing the furlough situation to an end and you are reverting back to ordinary circumstances. That's as may be, but you would then go back to obviously your full pay. But if you are on furlough, you can't be asked to dip in and out to sort of add a helping hand. You are, in effect, out of the business for that period of time.
Thanks, Sian. Another question about the system. If an employer insists that you attend work, but the work is not essential and could be done at home, is there any recourse for employees?
Yeah, you could, because obviously this relates to the government guidance that's being given. Coincidentally, I'm going to a training course myself this afternoon at 1 o'clock that covers all of this in terms of what are your rights if you believe that you are being put in a sort of difficult position by your employer, still being asked to go into work, but your employer is not operating social distancing, is not giving you the correct PPE. What are your rights then? Can you say you're downing tools and leaving? What are your rights in terms of whistleblowing? So I can, once I've sort of done my training on that, I can revert back to you and cascade, feedback to Deri so that he can pass that information on to his, onto the members. But in the meantime, what I would say is that there are always provisions in place for an employee if they believe that they are being put in imminent danger. There is legislation that will cover them. If they sort of resign or walk out of their job. I would say you should be taking legal advice in those circumstances before you take such drastic steps. But these are unprecedented times, and I can appreciate that people will be very worried if they're going into work in a sort of construction or manufacturing type scenario. They're working on a production line and they are having, even though they're being told stay 2 meters apart from everybody, that in practice is really impossible. I appreciate that they will be really worried. So as I say, I can get some information on what is the sort of, you know, legal standpoint on that, feed that back to Deri, and hopefully pass that on.
Thanks, Sian. So we've had a question about redundancies and their status at this point. So would we be challenging redundancies at the moment as non-meaningful?
Well, a redundancy can be challenged sort of at any point if somebody believes that it's not a genuine redundancy situation, if they believe that the process has been dealt with unfairly. So I would say that each case would have to be looked at sort of on its own merits. But if it's, you know, if you haven't had a meaningful consultation, if there hasn't been any sort of, you know, consideration as to what measures can be taken to avoid the redundancies, I would say that there's always a scope there for a challenge and potentially a claim of unfair dismissal.
Thanks, Sian. I think we've probably got time for 2 more questions that are remaining.
Anna,
yeah, go for it.
Sorry, I'm not quite sure if how I'm coming across, because I get a massive echo, so I may well sound like a robot. But I just wanted to check on some of the React eligibility stuff, just to say that Careers Wales are the key people who sign off, and Welsh Government have final say. So when it comes to things like zero contracts and stuff like that, it's important to still get in touch, because even if they fall outside the eligibility of React, there is still another support available.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. So we have had another question that was sent in advance about redundancy. And the questioner asks, there's talk of us being made redundant. What legal notice does the employer need to give me? What's the process they should be following?
Well, it will depend on the size of the organisation. Obviously, there are certain rules that the employer has to adhere to, depending on what size you have. If there are, 20 or more employees, 45 or more employees, then there are obviously time frames that have to be adhered to for the employer giving notice that there may be a potential redundancy. But these, even though there are, as we say, new measures coming into place, we're working in new ways, the general provisions, legislation that covers redundancy still applies. So it would be exactly the same. You would be entitled to consultation. You would be entitled to redundancy pay. You would be entitled to notice pay, entitled to sort of, meaningful consultation. So all of those still apply. So you should be, checking with your, trade union potentially on site that all these provisions are still being followed. And if you believe that they are being flouted in any way, or the employer is, trying to pull a fast one because of the situation we find ourselves in, then that should be highlighted and potentially legal advice sought.
Thanks, Sian. There's one other question that's come in from Sue, asking if it's possible to organise some sort of online meeting with people from Careers Wales and the Wales Union Learning Fund to look at ways to set up mutual support and information channels. I appreciate that might be something that you have to go away and think about, but the question came in.
It's a really good question, actually. And I think I'm in regular touch with the React team at Welsh Government and Careers Wales, and I don't think that would be a problem at all. I think they're really keen. They're aware that picking up notices or potential risk of redundancy workplaces at the moment is really difficult. And they've always relied on us a little bit as a trade union movement to give them a heads up on them. So I think they welcome that. Yeah. What I'll do is I'll speak to the React team and I'll arrange something and put it out through our networks.
Great, thanks, Deri. And there's one final question that was sent in advance saying, can I still do training if I'm furloughed?
Because if you're an apprentice, then you can. If your training would involve, that you're not in work and not doing anything to do with the business, if it is sort of generic training to your apprenticeship. And in those circumstances, in fact, you would have to revert back to, if you were doing a day a week training and your training provider is able to do that with you remotely still, for that one day, you would have to potentially revert to your normal pay under your apprenticeship scheme, as opposed to the sort of 80% of your wages that you're getting. So sort of quite complicated. But if you, in those situations, my reading of the sort of new regulations is that you can. I'd stand to be corrected on that. I know that you can't do any training. For example, if I was furloughed now and then I was doing some training in respect of, you know, our business, Slater and Gordon, I wouldn't be able to in those circumstances. But I think that in the apprenticeship situation where you are doing generic training, then that might be allowed.
Thanks, Sian. And another question from Sue just came in saying, how can we share examples of good practice in our redundancy support work? Perhaps that's one for you, Deri.
Yeah, we do collect sort of good practice and case on a sort of case study basis and sort of put that out. But I think at the moment, it'd be really good to get some examples. I know there's a couple going on this week, and Careers Wales have only just put their joint presentation briefing with Job Centre Plus online as of yesterday. So that's, you know, for workers who aren't in the workplace, we would have to sort of rely on their technology to beam that to them somehow. But any examples of how they're getting around some of these challenges, and I mean, the key thing for me, Anna, is to get to the people, the smaller groups of redundancies. I think if you've got a factory closure, you'd hope that we'd be able to get the support and the information to like a large scale redundancy. But there are going to be small groups, 1s, 2s, 5s, 10s going off, like being laid off or being made redundant. And I'd be particularly interested in the examples of how unions are, you know, getting the information out of their networks. We're certainly going to put this on our webpage as widely as possible, but most people have got our details on the website, so they can send us any good practice examples, and we'll put them all together. Anything that comes up as really good example of, you know, that other people should know about, we'll share it as widely as possible and send it to Welsh Government as well. And I'm sure the React team will be interested in it.
Thanks, Deri. Okay, we've answered all the questions. It was great to see so many come in. So just from like both of you, if you've got any final things to say before we sign off.
Well, I'd just like to say, you know, thank you, Deri, for inviting me to this webinar. I'm always really, you know, I really enjoy these. Obviously, it's nice when you have, you know, the face-to-face sort of feedback. But Anna, it's been brilliant, sort of, you know, the questions, and I'd really like to thank you for your support in getting me to this stage of the webinar. You know, 2 days ago, my technology would not have been able to get me to this point. So thank you both very much.
Yeah, we've had a bit of a journey, haven't we? But we got there in the end. Deri?
Yeah, and I just say that thanks, Sian, for helping us out with this, because I did have a horrible fear when the technology failed that I'd be landed with loads of employment law questions, and that's a dangerous scenario, trust me. But no, I think it's been really good. And like I said, our webpage is up now, and I just encourage officers and reps to get in touch as much as possible on issues like this, because we're around to support.
Thanks. And just to say finally, if you have missed anything or you want to come back and re-watch some of the webinar, or indeed all of it, a recording will be made available later today, so just keep a lookout for that. Thanks for tuning in, everybody, and stay safe in these unusual times. Bye-bye.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, bye.